Hello, this is Pastor Don Long, and this is our Jewish Roots broadcast for the week. I'm glad that you chose to tune in and hear what's going on in the world. We've been concentrating these weeks on what's going on in Israel, more the news of Israel than actually looking into the Jewish roots of Christianity. It's important that we understand our relationship with Israel, why as a nation it is vital for us to be in support of Israel. The Bible says in Genesis, where God speaks to Abraham, that Abraham or his people would be a blessing to the world. And certainly when we look historically and in the current environment of the world, Israel indeed is a blessing to the world, both in its technology that it contributes to the world, but its discoveries in health, science, physics, and chemistry. We find that the Jewish people are great contributors to the advancement of civilization. Any thought that maybe the Jewish nation should cease to exist, or those anti-Semites who believe that we ought to get rid of the Jews, simply would be cutting off our own future. One cannot help but wonder as we look back at the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews that were murdered in that Holocaust. How many advances in science were delivered? I can imagine the Almighty someday being asked the question, why was it that we did not have a cure for cancer? And the Almighty responds, I sent the cure for cancer, but unfortunately it was in a child or an adult that you chose to allow to go into the Holocaust and was murdered. It would seem that our future indeed is with the blessing of God's people. But the scriptures in Genesis also say that those who bless Abraham and his seed will be blessed by God. Those who curse him will be cursed. In other words, any nation, any group of people, but let's think of the nation of the United States. Any nation that will come alongside and bless God's people, that nation is going to be a blessing. Any nation that comes against Israel will in fact be under a curse. And the Bible elsewhere talks about the fact that woe to those nations that seek to divide Jerusalem. Well, you know, the United States was always a friend of the Jewish people. From the very founding of this country with our forefathers, there were open arms to welcome the Jewish people here. Most people do not realize it, but the chief financier for the American Revolution was a Jewish man by the name of Haim Solomon. And Haim went to great extent to raise funds for General Washington's army. In fact, if you go to Chicago, there's a statue there of three men, one of whom is George Washington, the other is Haim Solomon. And yet our textbooks in high school and college, history books, don't talk much about the role that he played. It is doubtful whether America financially could have survived the revolution without Haim Solomon. And so it is that as a nation, we have welcomed the Jewish people, certainly with President Harry S. Truman in 1948 being the first to recognize Israel as a nation, that when the United Nations had voted to grant them status as a nation, and they declared their independence as a nation, despite the warnings of the State Department, Harry S. Truman was the first leader of a nation to say, we recognize the new state of Israel. And through the years following that, the United States has always been a friend to Israel, despite the opposition of many, particularly in the State Department. I was talking about that last week. I don't intend to go over that again. But the history of the State Department, which I remind you is unelected bureaucrats, has been against Israel, but the nation itself has always been for it. Things have begun to take a turn with the current president, both in terms of his support for nations that are against Israel, but most recently in what took place in Geneva, where the president backed away from his own red line that he had defined that he would not allow Iran to cross, and sought an agreement with Iran. By the way, this was also happening behind closed doors for months and months, unknown to our allies, unknown to the Israelis, unknown to the Saudi Arabians, that the president was going to chart a course different than what he had publicly said in terms of sanctions and what the Congress of the United States had said. So we have taken a turn Even though the president says we support Israel, his actions show otherwise. And that doesn't speak well for the future of the United States biblically, because the Bible says, woe to those nations. To the extent that the president and his Secretary of State have talked about dividing Jerusalem, they stand in direct contradiction to the Word of God that says, woe to the nations that divide my city, Jerusalem. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, and today I want to share something from the National Review going back a few years, in fact 10 years ago, in July of 2003, William Bennett published an article called Moral Clarity and the Middle East, Why We Support Israel. William Bennett, by the way, is a great writer of morals and ethics, great books on raising children. He was Secretary of Education, and now he has written this article that I want to share with you. Let me quote from him. One of the lessons we learned on September 11th was that democracy is not just disliked by Islamists, it is hated. And one way to give in to terrorism rather than to fight it is to concur with the basis for that hatred and weaken democratic institutions and democracies. In the wake of September 11th, many argued that we brought the attack upon ourselves because of our support for Israel. Even were this true, we should no more end that support than we should eliminate religious freedom and women's rights in our own country, hallmarks of our democracy that also engaged the wrath of the terrorists who attacked us. And it beggars belief to think our support for Israel played much of any part of the attack on us. First of all, complaints about Israel ranked low with Osama bin Laden until he realized that ratcheting up those complaints to the top of his list would earn him more support from the Arab world. Second, if Israel is responsible for Islamist or Arabist wrath, I cannot not imagine just what Israel did to encourage Syria to swallow Lebanon, to encourage Saddam Hussein to unleash a bloodbath against Iran, to encourage Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, to encourage Kuwait to expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, to encourage the Taliban to destroy the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan, to encourage the slaughter of Christians in the Sudan, to encourage the bombings in Bali that killed 202 people, or to encourage church bombings in Pakistan. An honest look at Islamist or Arab wrath, or both, requires an honest conclusion. Israel's existence, or our support of it, simply cannot be responsible for the terrorism and violence we have borne witness to over the last decades. What these terrorists and thugs hate about all is liberal democracy, religious freedom, and any alternative claim to God or land that they themselves claim. This list includes America, Israel, Christianity, moderate Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism. It is a long list. When it comes to peace in the Middle East, most people think immediately of Israel and Israel's requirement to make peace with its Arab neighbors, even as its Arab neighbors seem to have a very hard time of making peace with themselves. Let me pause and add some of my own thoughts in what Secretary Bennett is saying here, because when you look in the Middle East, there is as much, if not more, Arab to Arab violence. Take a look at what's going on in Iraq, where we went in, and I think rightfully so, removed a dictator who threatened the world with war, but then we decided that we wanted to bring democracy to Iraq. By the way, how do you bring democracy to people who do not think in the terms of democracy? Democracy in America was born out of the thinking of our forefathers, and they envisioned a society, and they realized that key to that vision were several things. Number one is you needed a citizen group of people who were educated in democracy. What I mean by that is if you have people who've not been taught to think in democratic ways, then it's hard to impose democracy. Democracy cannot be imposed on people who don't understand what it is. Secondly, our forefathers were very clear that there needed to be a moral basis for democracy. One of our founders said that an immoral people cannot be expected to maintain democracy for very long. President Washington, at the end of his terms as president, declared that that was his concern for the future of America. That democracy presupposes that you have a moral people. If you have immoral people, then a democracy begins to degenerate into immoral acts. Thirdly, our founding fathers said that democracy requires a Christian worldview. Very interesting. They did not say that it required a religious worldview, but rather a Christian worldview, a view that all men are created equal by God. So it presupposes a view in a creator God, a God that created all men equal, black, white, women, male. All men are created equal, and that all men have or should have an equal opportunity to success. So when you come into a nation like Iraq, or any nation that has been under a dictatorship, maybe has a rule of bribery, everything happens because people buy votes, buy people off, and then you impose democracy, how does that democracy work? How does democracy work in a place where guns rule? Where, in fact, if you vote the wrong way, you're shot dead. You know, if a group of people are voting and 5 people ahead of you vote for the wrong person or are executed, how likely is it that you're going to vote for the wrong person in the eyes of the group that owns the weapons? Intimidation is the rule of a broken society. Such things, by the way, have happened in our own nation, whether it be the mob rule that took place and some would say continues to take place in Chicago, whether it's the rule of union thugs that insist their membership vote their way, or whether it's simply the Black Panthers at the voting polls down south with their baseball bats in their hands, in just an unspoken intimidation. Democracy assumes that you have a moral people and a religious people. And so we come to Iraq and we want to impose that. Doesn't mean that it's going to work. Now, let me continue with Secretary Bennett. He says this: nonetheless, Israel does stand out, and it stands out for 3 reasons. It is the only country in the region that has a majority of Jews. Number 2, it is the only country in the region that gives people of all faiths and nationalities full religious, civic, and political freedom. And number 3, with 2 exceptions, it is not recognized by any other Arab state. Thus, we come to see how we can help broker a peace deal between Israel and her neighbors. Now, let's talk about these 3 things that Secretary Bennett found out. Notice this. It is the only country in the region that has a majority of Jews. People say Israel should not be a Jewish nation. Well, there are quite a number of Arabic nations that are Muslim nations. In fact, in many Islamic nations, if you're not a Muslim, you can't vote, if there's any voting that takes place at all. In nations where Sharia law is in the law of the land, if you're not a Muslim, you don't have very many rights at all. So of all the nations of the world, we find that Israel, as God decreed it would be, is a nation where the majority of the people are Jews. But in the midst of this, one would think that the evil would be for Israel as if not only are they a Jewish nation, but only Jews can vote. Only Jews have the authority. Only Jews have voting rights. Only Jews can do these things. See, if we took what's going on in the Arab world and put it into the nation of Israel, that's what it would look like. But that is not Israel. Israel, in fact, gives full political rights to all religious groups. Whether you're a Muslim, a Druze, a Christian, whether you're a Jew, a Buddhist, if you're a citizen of Israel, you have full voting rights. So that most people, by the way, don't know this, and most people I find who are anti-Israel are totally ignorant about that when it comes to example for the Knesset, which is their government, that there are Arab Muslims in the Knesset. Now, that's unheard of in the world of the Middle East, to have non-believers in your government. You can't go to a Muslim country and find a Christian or a Jew that is sitting in seats of power. It is rather just the people of Islamic faith. But that's not so in Israel. So that part of the division in the Israeli government is you have Arab Israelis who are Muslim in their faith, but they've been elected by the people of their district, and so they sit in the Knesset, they have full rights. So does every citizen of Israel. It's a myth to think that Israel somehow is oppressive. Israel has been accused of being apartheid. Anybody that accuses Israel of being apartheid is vastly ignorant to the point of stupidity of not knowing what apartheid is, nor knowing the truth about what Israel is. In apartheid South Africa, the blacks had no vote, and therefore they had no representation in any government councils. In Israel, as I've already stated, members of any religion, members of any nationality can in fact be members of the Knesset. So they're far from apartheid. They're the only true democracy in the Middle East. Secondly, Secretary Bennett mentioned that Israel is the only country in the region that gives people of all faiths total access and total freedom in their religious expression. You know, when the Jordanians controlled what the world calls the West Bank, actually the Bible calls that Judea and Samaria, it is the heartland of the land God gave to the Jewish people. Think about that for a minute. If you say that, well, the West Bank, as our president has said and as Secretary Kerry has said, well, that belongs to the Palestinians, you are coming directly against Almighty God. God said Judea and Samaria belong to the Jewish people. By the way, so did the League of Nations say that it belongs to the Jewish people. But think about it. When Jordan, at the end of the War of Independence for Israel, controlled what was called the West Bank, and therefore they controlled half of Jerusalem. There was a wall between Jerusalem, and people on the Jordanian side of the wall would shoot at people on the other side. You did not find Israelis climbing to the top of buildings and shooting people in East Jerusalem. You found people in East Jerusalem climbing to the top of buildings and shooting people over the walls in West Jerusalem. By the way, that attitude still happens today. When people complain about these massive walls along highways in Israel, they're only at places where the Palestinians are shooting people. And rather than go over and destroy the villages that are there, they simply build a wall so you can't shoot over them. Ignorance, again, causes you to have the wrong view. When the Jordanians controlled East Jerusalem, the Jewish sites were not open to the Jewish people. There was no such thing as religious freedom. Synagogues were destroyed. The Western Wall, which is a holiest site for all Jews worldwide, was off limits to Jews. In other words, there was no religious freedom. In 1967, when Israel reclaimed East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the first thing they did was open all religious sites to all people, so that the Western Wall, the synagogues, the churches, the mosques, whatever religious site is there is protected under Israeli right. If you're a Muslim, you can go to the mosque of your choice anywhere in Israel. If you're a Christian, you can go to any church of your choice anywhere in Israel. And if you're a Jew, interestingly, you can go to any site, any synagogue you want, except one. And this shows you the power of the pressure of the world. You can't go up on Temple Mount. And the reason was when Moshe Dayan and his army took over East Jerusalem, they wanted to, as a goodwill gesture, let the head of the Islamic mosque there still be in control of that area. However, when Jews would go up in that area, there would be riots. And rather than confront the riots and say, oh, there's the bad Israelis, putting down these people, they restricted when their own people can go there. To me, that is the height of a world not understanding who believes in freedom and who doesn't. If Jews go up on Temple Mount, and the few times they're there, they're not allowed to pray. In fact, I'll tell you this, as Christians, and I have taken tours to Israel, and on some of them, when I've led a tour, we don't go up on Temple Mount, but I've been on some where we go up there, and we're cautioned about praying there. We're not allowed as Christians to pray on Temple Mount. And walking around Temple Mount, you'll find Muslim men who that's their goal, is to watch and make sure you're not praying. So if you are up there and your lips are even moving, in silence you're praying, they will force you to leave Temple Mount. So where is religious freedom? The point is there is no religious freedom in the Muslim world. I cannot go to Saudi Arabia today and build a church. If I were to go to Bethlehem as a Christian today, the Arab population of Bethlehem would put such pressure on me that it would begin to be very unsafe for me to remain in Bethlehem. When the Palestinian terrorists took over one of the Catholic churches in Bethlehem, they destroyed everything in it. They destroyed the Bibles, they ripped down the tapestries, while they were in there, they destroyed things. And not a word from our government, not a word that came from the United Nations saying, that we condemn that act. But I guarantee you, if an Israeli soldier went into a mosque, they took it over, and then when they left, all the Qurans were destroyed, you better believe there'd be an outcry in this world. Why? Why is the world silent when the Muslims destroy Christian or Jewish things, but they're not silent when something else happens? Could it be because the world understands that if you attack the Quran, there's going to be massive riots and bloodshed in the world? Could it be that newspapers don't print the truth about this because maybe their editor will be assassinated or their buildings will be blown up? But they know that Christians are not going to kill them when you attack the Bible. They know that Jews are not going to kill you if you destroy a Torah. There's only one religion that will kill people, destroy buildings, if you criticize their religion. In most Islamic nations, it is considered against the law to speak negatively in any form, in a movie, in a book, about the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, there is a move in the United States to get those kind of laws here. Let me ask you, why is it wrong to criticize the Prophet Muhammad, but it's not wrong to criticize Jesus Christ? Why is it okay to make a movie that defames Jesus, pictures him in derogatory terms? That's okay. But if I make a movie or print a book about Muhammad, even stating facts we know that are true about Muhammad, but they're not very nice to know, we're not speaking lies, we're speaking truth, but that would create riots. Why is it that the President of the United States made it a national issue over some pastor, and I'm not saying I agree with him, but a pastor in Florida who was going to burn a Quran? And why is it that the President of the United States went on national TV to decry that, to say that's terrible, but he doesn't go on TV and say he's against things when Christian churches in Egypt are being burned to the ground and Coptic churches, their Bibles are being destroyed? Why does he say nothing when it is the Islamist tearing down the Christian, but he instantly says something when it's a Christian person, supposed Christian person, doing something against Islam? Well, you see, Israel is the only nation in the Middle East that maintains freedom of religion. I find it interesting that the liberals in the press and in our universities, even right here, Fitchburg State University, where people will make statements against Israel, But they don't realize that Israel supports freedom of religion where the others don't. Israel allows every citizen to vote where the others don't. Israel gives full rights to women, whereas every Arab nation gives women no rights. By the way, I don't understand why all the women's movements in America aren't very vocal in support of Israel and very much against the Arab countries on that question alone. Why not? And for those in the gay and lesbian community, if you're a gay person, lesbian person in the Muslim countries, you will be executed. But in Israel, you have full rights. How can somebody who's in that community say, I'm against Israel, or they practice apartheid? I say again, you're either ignorant or willfully blind to what the truth is. So let me finish up with what Secretary Bennett said here. He said, finally, the United States has a moral and legal obligation to maintain its embassy and ambassador in Jerusalem. That sentence comes from the 2000 Republican Party platform. Now listen, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and should remain an undivided city accessible to people of all faiths. That sentence comes from a platform. Indeed, most Americans today would be surprised to learn that, in fact, the U.S. Embassy in Israel is not in Jerusalem. People don't know that. It's in Tel Aviv. If we as a nation want to maintain our moral clarity in supporting democracy, we should be very clear that we will not tolerate any other capital for Israel. That is their choice. In the same way that no nation in the world can tell us where our capital is. If all of a sudden Argentina says we're sending our ambassador to the United States and we're going to put our embassy in Boston, we'd say, wait a minute, ambassadors go to the capital city. And if they said, well, we do not recognize Washington as your capital, we're going to put our embassy in Boston, that would be an affront to us. We'd say, who are you? And by the way, don't bother sending your ambassador. No, all our ambassadors go to Washington. And thus it is in every nation in the world, our ambassadors are sent to the capital that that nation says is their capital. Israel says that Jerusalem is their capital. And our Congress has voted money to make the capital in Jerusalem, the embassy in Jerusalem, but our presidents don't receive it. Moral clarity says that we got to start thinking right about Israel, its people, and its capital. This is Pastor Don Long, and this has been Jewish Roots.